Welcome to Court and Crime with Lonnie Coombs, where we'll be digging deep into the biggest courtroom dramas, true crime stories, legal news, and compelling cold.
With my 2 decades of courtroom experience as a criminal prosecutor, as well as my years as a broadcast journalist and legal analyst, I'm going to peel back the layers for you as we do our daily deep dive together. All right, today, big news out of Matt Hampton after 35 days in court. 12 jurors, 8 men and 4 women are now deliberating the fate of rapper and entertainment mogul Sean Diddy Combs. Now, this is a federal criminal trial. He's facing 5 counts racketeering, conspiracy, or RICO, 2 counts of sex trafficking, and 2 counts of transportation for the purpose of prostitution. Now, he faces some serious prison time if convicted, a potential life sentence on the RICO charge. Okay, let's talk about this jury for a moment. 8 men, 4 women who will decide what the facts really are and how the law applies. Here now, their ages range from 30 to 74 years old, and all of them have a college or advanced degree. And already there appear to be some issues arising in that jury room. A note came out to the judge soon after they started their deliberations this morning saying, "We have a juror number 25. They called him out. We are concerned cannot follow your Honor's instructions. May you please intervene." Well, after consulting the attorneys, the judge responded with a note of his own. He said, "I received your note. I remind every juror of their duty to deliberate and their obligation to follow my instruction on the law. With that instruction in mind, please continue deliberating." Now, these jurors have listened to over 6 weeks of testimony, very graphic details, including videos of alleged drug-fueled sexual encounters with male escorts, physical violence, and emotional coercion. They also saw texts and heard voice notes, revealing very complex relationships between Combs and the alleged victims here, Cassie Ventura, and a woman using the pseudonym Jane. Many of the facts weren't actually in dispute, but how they were being interpreted were. The prosecution said this was a criminal enterprise run by Combs to facilitate and cover up these coerced sexual encounters, and that the women involved were forced or coerced into these relationships. Now, on the other hand, the defense has argued that these were consenting adults all choosing this lifestyle and that the government shouldn't put crime scene tape up around your bedroom, saying that this whole prosecution is an overreach. I'll discuss all of this with 2 attorneys who have spent many years in the courtroom. Nima Romani is a former federal prosecutor and the president of West Coast Trial Lawyers. He is responsible for putting more than 1,000 criminal defendants in prison, and Edric Eric Fatties. He's also a former federal prosecutor who now does both criminal and civil litigation. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. I really appreciate the fact that you have this experience as a federal prosecutor. So, you have been in court on cases like this. Neon, let me start with you first. As trial attorneys, we have experienced just how crucial those closing arguments can be. Right now, here there were 2 very different styles of lawyering in the closings. The prosecution.
We started with Christy Slavik's opening argument, and you're right, Lonnie. It was a little dry. She was methodical. She was going through each of the offenses and the elements. And then, of course, you had Mark Ignifilo, right? One of the most experienced criminal defense.
Slavik's opening argument, and you're right, Lonnie. It was a little dry. She was methodical. She was going through each of the offenses and the elements. And then, of course, you had Mark Ignifilo, right? One of the most experienced criminal defense attorneys in New York, maybe the country, and he had a much more emotional style, and he was in some ways mocking the government's prosecution, like you said, and said, "Wow, look at these raids in Los Angeles and Miami. Look at all this baby oil and lube that's taken off the street. Look how safe we are now." Really flippant. So then you have Maureen Comey, the assistant U.S. attorney who delivered the government's rebuttal, a little bit more emotional. I liked her style a little bit more, but really this is style over substance, hopefully after 2 months. The jurors aren't basing their decisions on the closing arguments, but if you ask me, I tend to like that emotional style a little bit more. So even though I'm very prosecution, I have to agree with the way Agnifilo handled his closing if I had to choose between the 2. Well, after so many days in court, Shaking it up a little bit, getting their attention is always a good thing. But Eric, when you're in front of a jury, credibility is key, right? The credibility of the witnesses and the credibility of the attorneys. There were a couple of arguments that defense attorney Mark Agnico made in his closing that raised a few eyebrows. So one was when he was talking about the payments made to the male escorts, and he was saying that Combs was paying for their time rather than for sex. And the second one I think upset a lot of people, actually, was he described that Combs' relationship with Cassie Ventura. We talked about how it was violent and abusive. They admitted to all of that on the video, but then he called it a great modern love story. Do you think that those arguments worked? Or do you think he was pushing it too far and perhaps hurt his own credibility in saying those things? As an attorney, you can absolutely overplay your hand, and you've got to be careful about that. Because, Lonnie, as you mentioned, there are 4 women on the jury. And so, some of these arguments that he was making, in addition to the ones you mentioned, he also, made an argument that was essentially that the survivors were in line with women empowerment, and they had agency, and they wanted to do this, and God bless them, and good for them. And I'm just not sure that struck the right tone with this jury, who is deliberating now on a sex trafficking charge, a very serious charge. And so you've got to be careful about, playing into stereotypes and tropes that these individuals in that jury room have likely experienced, either themselves or know folks who have experienced those. It could offend them, it could insult them, and so yes, you can damage your own credibility. And the jury starts to think, gosh, this guy's trying to sell me this, which is bogus. What else is he trying to sell me? Yeah, and that personal experience of the jurors really does come into play right in that deliberation room, Anna. The prosecutors argued a key point in closing here that I think many people were missing before, that they explained that for the sex trafficking charges, you only need to find one incident, right? One incident of force, fraud, or coercion. Just one time where all those elements were met, rather than looking at the entire relationship between Combs and these women being forced or coerced you. Know when there's a long-term relationship. Like these 2 women had here, there's ups and downs in the relationship. Do you think it actually makes it harder for the prosecution to get them to focus on just that one incident and find them guilty? On that one incident, Lonnie, absolutely. And again, I believe these women were trafficked. But one of the questions that jurors in these types of cases have is, well, if you're abused, if you were assaulted, why did you stay with your abuser? And we saw this argument work with some success recently in the Harvey Weinstein case. Here's someone who's been convicted of sexual assault twice. The whole Me Too movement started because of him. And during the retrial there in New York, 3 victims continued to have personal and professional relationships with Weinstein and the jurors. Ultimately acquitted on one, deadlocked on a second, and only convicted on a third. So when you have emails and text messages from Cassie, words of affirmation showing how much she loved the freak-offs and wanted to freak off again and get freaky. And you had Mia, who had some inconsistent statements, and Jane, who her text messages were better, but, seemingly she would acquiesce. And she asked Combs for money, maybe look like somewhat of a transactional relationship. It does give the defense something to work with there. And again, the reason these cases are hard is, like you said, jurors, they bring their preconceived notions into that jury deliberation room. And when you're talking about really contentious things like sexual assault and Me Too, it's hard. To get 12 out of 12 jurors, I personally again believe that they were sex trafficked, but these are very difficult charges given some of the evidence that came in that did support the defense, and frankly, that's why they went from having a 12-week-long case in chief to 2 days. And ultimately, 30 minutes. They felt confident that they'd raised reasonable doubt during their cross-examination of these witnesses. Yeah, really good points. And Eric, I want to follow up with you on this. We can talk about the law all day long, but the big elephant in the room might be just how we as a society view sexual abuse in a relationship then. I think we're at a place with the Me Too movement where, the pendulum is swinging back from the extreme position where it was like believe all victims, to recognizing that due process is still very important in the whole process. This case, the whole thing is really based on these sexual relationships, whether they were consensual or coerced. Do you think because of that, Eric, it makes it more difficult for the jury to really work through all those issues together? I do, in part because, like Nima said, these folks have their own experiences, their own perspectives.